Before Drake became one of the most commercially dominant rappers in history, he had a problem almost no future rap superstar would want. People already knew his face. They just did not know him as a rapper. Before the #1 albums, billion-stream songs, rap battles, memes, sold-out arenas, and nearly 2 decades of chart dominance, Aubrey Drake Graham was a teenage actor from Toronto playing Jimmy Brooks on Degrassi, The Next Generation. And that created an unusual starting point. Most rappers begin by trying to become famous. Drake began by trying to convince people that the thing making him famous was not the thing he wanted to be remembered for. He wanted music. But in the mid-2000s, Toronto was not yet viewed as one of hip-hop's global capitals, and Drake did not look like the traditional rapper the industry was accustomed to promoting. He could rap, but he also wanted to sing. He wanted to write about ambition and money, but also insecurity, failed relationships, loneliness, and the emotional consequences of success. At the time, those identities did not fit together as naturally as they would later. So Drake's career became a 20-year experiment in breaking boundaries. Could a Canadian television actor become a legitimate rapper? Could a rapper sing without being treated like an R&B artist? Could vulnerable music dominate a genre built around confidence? Could somebody become one of hip-hop's biggest stars while constantly moving outside hip-hop? Could that success survive overexposure? Could it survive changing generations? And eventually, could it even survive losing the biggest rap battle of his career? Every Drake project exists somewhere inside those questions. And the strange part is that every time Drake solved one problem, his success created another one. Drake was born Aubrey Drake Graham in Toronto in 1986. Long before he became one of music's most recognizable names, acting gave him his first real public identity. As a teenager, he joined Degrassi, The Next Generation, playing Jimmy Brooks. For years, that was how people knew him. It gave Drake money, visibility, and an audience. But it also created something he would spend the beginning of his music career trying to escape: the label of actor-turned-rapper. Hip-hop has historically been suspicious of outsiders, and an actor from a Canadian teen drama was not the most obvious candidate to become one of the genre's dominant figures. Drake therefore could not begin by assuming people would respect him. He had to earn that respect. While still connected to acting, he started independently releasing music. There was no guaranteed rap career waiting for him. There was no certainty that the United States would care. There was no guarantee that his combination of singing, rapping, and emotional writing would even fit the market. But between 2006 and 2009, 3 mixtapes gradually changed that: Room for Improvement, Comeback Season, and eventually So Far Gone. Those 3 projects would transform Drake from an actor making rap music into an artist the music industry could no longer ignore. Before we get into that journey, if you're enjoying the video, please hit the like button. Drop your opinion in the comments. Which Drake era do you think was his absolute peak? Share this video with another hip-hop lover. And if you like deep dives into the artists, albums, beefs, and stories behind hip-hop, subscribe to Music Explained. Now let's go back to where the Drake discography really started. In 2006, Drake released Room for Improvement, and the title was surprisingly honest. This was not the fully developed Drake who would later build an entire generation of music around emotional rap. This was a young artist trying to prove he belonged in hip-hop at all. The mixtape showed clear ambition. Drake wanted listeners to hear technical ability. He wanted them to recognize that acting was not simply funding a hobby. He was studying rap. He was writing seriously. And he was beginning to imagine a life in which music would eventually replace television. But Room for Improvement sounds like an artist still searching for the identity that would later become obvious. The balance between rapping and singing was not fully developed. The production did not yet have the cold, atmospheric Toronto character that would define his breakthrough years. And the emotional writing that later became one of Drake's signatures was still developing. That is what makes the project important. It allows listeners to hear Drake before the formula existed, before OVO, before Young Money, before Noah 40. Shabib became inseparable from his sound, before Drake understood exactly what kind of artist Drake was supposed to be. Room for improvement was not a superstar arriving. It was somebody giving himself permission to believe that becoming one was possible. 1 year later, Drake sounded more confident. Comeback Season represented a significant step forward. He was still developing, but the personality became easier to recognize. There was more ambition, more introspection, more awareness of relationships, more interest in melody, and more of the contradiction that would eventually become central to Drake's appeal. He wanted to sound like somebody destined for success while constantly discussing the insecurity that came with wanting success so badly. That balance was unusual. Traditional rap confidence normally says, "I already have everything." Drake increasingly sounded like, "I know I'm going to have everything, but I'm already worried about what it's going to cost me." That difference mattered. Comeback Season also helped establish Drake more seriously inside the music industry. The actor was becoming a rapper with momentum, but momentum was not enough. He still needed one project capable of converting industry curiosity into mainstream demand. That happened 2 years later. So Far Gone changed everything. The original mixtape arrived in 2009 and became the project that finally made Drake impossible to explain as simply the guy from Degrassi. Songs like Best I Ever Had broke through far beyond mixtape culture. Suddenly, the United States knew Drake as an artist. But the project's importance goes deeper than one hit. So Far Gone helped establish the sound that would define the next phase of mainstream rap. Drake could rap competitively. Then, without treating it like a separate identity, he could move into singing. He could discuss women, loneliness, insecurity, ambition, luxury, and emotional confusion inside the same project. The mood mattered too. Working closely with producer Noah 40 Shabib, Drake began developing the spacious, dark, late-night production style that would eventually become closely associated with Toronto. Nothing felt aggressively bright. The music sounded isolated, cold, expensive, but emotional. That combination became enormously influential. So Far Gone also arrived during the period when Drake's relationship with Lil Wayne and Young Money was becoming central to his rise. Wayne was one of the biggest rappers in the world, and his endorsement gave Drake credibility inside a culture that might otherwise have continued questioning the actor-turned-rapper story. By 2009, the question had changed. People were no longer asking whether Drake could become a rapper. They were asking how big he was about to become. That question created the pressure surrounding Thank Me Later. A successful mixtape creates excitement. A major label debut creates expectations. Drake had gone from unsigned curiosity to one of music's most anticipated new stars incredibly quickly. Now he had to prove the hype could survive an official album. Thank Me Later debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 with 447,000 copies sold in its first week. Commercially, Drake had arrived, but artistically, something felt less settled. The album contained many of the things listeners already liked about him: fame, relationships, self-doubt, ambition, rapping mixed with melody, major collaborators. But Drake later expressed dissatisfaction with how rushed parts of the process felt compared with the music he truly wanted to make. That frustration is important because Thank Me Later became successful enough to give Drake power. And Drake used that power to make the album that would define him. The debut proved Drake could sell records. The next album would prove he could change what a rap superstar sounded like. Take Care is where the pieces finally locked together. If Thank Me Later was Drake adapting to sudden fame, Take Care was Drake building a world that completely belonged to him. The production became darker, slower, more atmospheric. Noah 40. Shabib's influence became essential. The melodies felt more confident. The writing became more vulnerable. And Drake stopped treating emotion as something that needed to be balanced with traditional rap toughness. He made vulnerability part of the toughness. Songs like Marvin's Room showed just how far he was willing to push that idea. This was a superstar sounding jealous, lonely, drunk, insecure, and emotionally confused. And instead of weakening Drake's image, Those emotions became part of the reason listeners connected with him. Then there were records like Headlines, HYFR, The Motto, and the title track. Drake could move between introspective R&B and competitive rap without making the album feel like two separate artists. That became the formula. And the industry responded. Take Care debuted at #1 with more than 600,000 copies sold in its opening week. It eventually won the Grammy for Best Rap Album, Drake's first Grammy victory. But the larger legacy cannot be measured only through awards. After Take Care, emotionally vulnerable rap became easier to imagine at the absolute center of popular music. The separation between rapper and singer weakened. The atmospheric sound associated with Toronto became internationally influential, and Drake discovered something crucial. He did not need to become the rapper people expected. He could make the expectations change around him. By 2013, Drake sounded less surprised by his own success. Nothing Was the Same is the sound of an artist who no longer needs confirmation that he belongs. The insecurity is still there, but now it exists beside dominance. Started from the bottom, turned Drake's rise into a victory chant. Worst Behavior sounded confrontational. Tuscan Leather opened the album with extended confidence. And Hold On, We're Going Home demonstrated just how naturally Drake could move into pop without abandoning the larger identity of the album. This era is important because Drake was no longer simply building a sound. He was building mythology around himself. Toronto became the Six. OVO became increasingly central to his identity. His relationships, rivalries, and success became part of an ongoing story fans could follow from album to album. Nothing Was the Same debuted at #1 with roughly 658,000 copies. At the time, it represented his largest opening week. But the most important change was psychological. On Take Care, Drake sounded like someone processing becoming one of rap's biggest stars. On Nothing Was the Same, he sounded like someone expecting to remain there. Then Drake became colder. If You're Reading. This It's Too Late arrived unexpectedly in February 2015. And compared with the romantic atmosphere associated with much of his earlier work, this project felt aggressive, suspicious, claustrophobic, paranoid. Drake sounded obsessed with loyalty and betrayal. Songs like Energy, Know Yourself, No Tellin', and Six God leaned heavily toward rap. That mattered because the bigger Drake became as a pop artist, the louder one criticism became. Was he becoming too much of a singer? Could he really stand beside elite rappers? If You're Reading. This It's Too Late felt like an answer. Drake did not abandon melody completely, but the project made competitive rapping the center of attention. It debuted at #1 with more than 500,000 equivalent album units. The commercial performance proved Drake no longer required months of traditional promotion to create an event. He could release music suddenly, and the audience would arrive immediately. But there was another shift happening too. Drake's relationship with fame was becoming darker. Success had given him everything he wanted. Now he increasingly sounded worried about everyone surrounding it. 7 months later, Drake joined Future for What a Time to Be Alive. The timing was perfect. Future was in the middle of an extraordinary creative run. His darker Atlanta trap sound had become one of the dominant forces in rap. Drake was simultaneously coming off one of the hardest rap-focused projects of his career. Instead of forcing Future into a traditional Drake environment, the collaborative mixtape leaned heavily into the sound surrounding Future and producer Metro Boomin. That decision revealed one of Drake's greatest career skills: adaptation. Drake has repeatedly entered other musical environments and found a way to sound comfortable without completely losing his own identity. What a Time to Be Alive sounded spontaneous, celebratory, expensive, and competitive. It debuted at #1. But more importantly, it demonstrated that Drake could operate inside Atlanta trap without needing to become an Atlanta rapper. That ability to absorb sounds from different scenes would become increasingly important, because the next phase of Drake's career was going global. For years, Drake had teased an album connected directly to Toronto. Originally discussed as Views from the Six, the project eventually arrived simply as Views. By this point, Drake was no longer trying to become famous. He was trying to build an album large enough to represent the world around his fame. Toronto remained central. The CN Tower dominated the artwork. Weather, distance, loyalty, and hometown identity shaped the atmosphere. But musically, Drake was already expanding far beyond Toronto. Dancehall influence became especially important. One Dance became one of the biggest songs of his career. Controlla pushed further into Caribbean-inspired rhythms. Too Good with Rihanna strengthened that global pop direction. At the same time, songs like Western Road Flows and Views reminded listeners that traditional rap remained part of the foundation. Commercially, Views was enormous. It opened with more than 1 million equivalent album units and spent 13 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. This was Drake transforming from one of hip-hop's biggest stars into something closer to a global streaming institution. But the scale also created criticism. Some listeners felt the album was too long, too carefully designed for broad appeal, too calculated. That tension would follow Drake for years. The more people he could satisfy, the harder it became to make one project that felt focused. Views expanded Drake's empire, but it also introduced the problem of becoming too big for one sound. Drake's solution was simple. Stop calling the project an album. More Life was marketed as a playlist. That word gave Drake enormous freedom. A traditional album creates expectations about cohesion. A playlist can move wherever it wants. So Drake moved everywhere. UK grime, dancehall, Afrobeats, R&B, rap, house-influenced production. British artists and producers became highly visible throughout the project. Skepta appeared, Giggs appeared, Uriah Smith appeared, Sampha appeared. Young Thug and Travis Scott also contributed. This was Drake acting less like a rapper representing one scene and more like a curator connecting multiple scenes. The approach was commercially successful. More Life debuted at #1 and generated massive streaming numbers. But culturally, it raised a more complicated question. Was Drake expanding hip-hop by exposing global sounds to his audience, or was he benefiting from scenes that other artists had built? That debate would follow him increasingly as his career became more international. But regardless of interpretation, More Life demonstrated something important. Drake understood the streaming era earlier than many traditional album artists. The audience did not necessarily care what the project was called. They cared that new Drake music had arrived. Then came the most chaotic album cycle of Drake's career to that point. Scorpion arrived in 2018 during the aftermath of Drake's feud with Pusha T. Pusha's diss track, The Story of Adidon, revealed publicly that Drake had a son. Suddenly, the conversation surrounding Drake's new album was not only music, it was reputation, fatherhood, privacy, rap credibility, and whether one of the biggest artists in the world had just suffered a public defeat. Drake could have delayed the album. Instead, he incorporated the situation directly into it. Scorpion became a 25-track double album. One side leaned more toward rap, the other leaned further into R&B, and the sheer size reflected what Drake had become. He was no longer serving one audience, he had multiple Drake audiences. The rap audience, the R&B audience, the pop audience, the streaming audience, and almost all of them expected something. Commercially, Scorpion became enormous. It debuted at #1 with more than 700,000 equivalent album units and shattered first-week streaming records in the United States. God's Plan became a #1 phenomenon. Nice for What reached #1. In My Feelings became another #1 hit and one of the year's largest viral songs. That commercial dominance created one of the central contradictions of Drake's career. He could lose a rap battle and still dominate popular music. That would become even more important years later. Scorpion showed that public embarrassment and commercial failure were not the same thing. Drake could absorb a cultural hit and still control the charts. 1 year later, Drake proved something even stranger. He did not need completely new music to release a #1 project. Care Package collected older loose songs that longtime fans had already known for years. Many originally came from Drake's blog era and SoundCloud-style release period. Tracks like Dreams Money Can Buy, Club Paradise, Trust Issues, and 5 a.m. in Toronto had existed outside his traditional albums. For years, those songs were central to serious Drake fandom, but were scattered across the internet. Care Package finally placed them together on streaming services, and it debuted at number 1. Think about what that means. By 2019, Drake's archive had become commercially valuable enough that old songs could function like a major new release. The project was nostalgia, but it was also proof of catalog power. Drake had released so much music outside his albums that his unofficial history had become almost as important as the official one. Dark Lane demo tapes continued that loose release philosophy. This was not a carefully constructed traditional studio album. It gathered leaked songs, previously released tracks, and new material into a mixtape-style package. The project arrived during the early period of the COVID-19 pandemic, when music promotion and daily life had suddenly changed. One of its biggest tracks, Toozy Slide, was perfectly designed for the social media era. The song came with a dance simple enough to spread quickly across TikTok and other platforms, but the project itself was darker than that viral hit suggested. Songs like Chicago Freestyle returned to the atmospheric, isolated Drake sound that longtime listeners associated with earlier periods. Commercially, Dark Lane demo tapes debuted at number 2, a rare position for Drake by this stage, but the project never felt like the major statement. It felt like preparation, because Drake was already teasing the next official album, and expectations around that album became enormous. Certified Lover Boy became one of the most anticipated releases of Drake's career. The album had been teased, delayed, and discussed for months. Even the title immediately leaned into the Drake stereotype. For years, people had joked about Drake being emotional, romantic, sensitive, obsessed with women and relationships. Instead of rejecting that image, he turned it into branding. The cover art became instantly recognizable, the title became meme-friendly, and the album attempted to deliver almost every version of Drake at once. There was rapping, R&B pop, relationship music, competitive records, major features. The project debuted at number 1 with more than 600,000 equivalent album units and generated an enormous first week of streaming. Multiple songs occupied the top positions of the Billboard Hot 100. Commercially, Drake's power was still unquestionable. But critically, the old problem returned. Could an artist capable of making music for everyone still surprise anyone? Some fans loved the familiarity. Others felt Drake had become too comfortable inside the formula he had created. That criticism set up one of the most unexpected decisions of his career. Less than a year later, Drake released Honestly, Nevermind with almost no warning. And instead of giving listeners another traditional rap album, he moved heavily toward dance music, house, electronic textures, club rhythms, singing, long stretches with very little traditional rapping. The reaction was immediate. Many listeners were confused. Some hated it. Some wondered why one of the biggest rappers alive had suddenly created an album that barely sounded like mainstream rap. But that reaction is exactly what makes Honestly, Nevermind interesting. Drake had spent years being criticized for playing things too safely. Then he released one of the least predictable albums of his career, and was criticized because it did not sound enough like the Drake people wanted. The album still debuted at number 1, and over time, parts of its sound received more appreciation as dance and house influences became increasingly visible across mainstream music. Whether someone loves or hates, Honestly Nevermind, the project matters because Drake took a real commercial risk at a point where he had no financial need to take one. And then, only months later, he changed direction again. If Honestly Nevermind made listeners question whether Drake still cared about rap, her loss answered quickly. Drake teamed with 21 Savage for a collaborative album that returned aggressively toward rap. The chemistry made sense. 21 represented a younger Atlanta generation. Drake represented the superstar capable of entering almost any contemporary rap environment. Together, they created something darker and more confrontational than Drake's previous album. Songs like Rich Flex immediately became cultural moments. The album debuted at number 1 with more than 400,000 equivalent album units, and the transition itself became part of the story. Within months, Drake had gone from house music to a collaborative rap album. That rapid movement demonstrated both his greatest strength and one of the biggest criticisms surrounding him. Drake could become almost anything. But when an artist can become almost anything, it becomes difficult to identify which version represents the real center. By 2023, Drake was confronting a strange problem. Fans kept asking for the old Drake. But what exactly did that mean? Did they want Take Care Drake? Nothing was the same. Drake, if you're reading this, it's too late. Drake? Views Drake? Drake had already reinvented himself enough times that nostalgia now referred to multiple different versions of the same artist. For All the Dogs was promoted partly around the idea of reconnecting with that older energy. But the final project was huge, modern, and feature-heavy. J. Cole appeared. SSA appeared. 21 Savage returned. Yeah appeared. Bad Bunny appeared. The album moved between rapping, singing, contemporary production, and familiar Drake relationship themes. It debuted at number 1. First-person shooter with J. Cole also became historically important for Drake's chart record. But creatively, the conversation remained divided. Was Drake still evolving? Or had Drake become a giant streaming ecosystem where every previous version of himself simply continued existing at once? That question would soon become less important, because in 2024, the conversation around Drake changed completely. Drake's conflict with Kendrick Lamar was not simply another celebrity disagreement. It became one of the biggest rap battles of the streaming era. The battle produced diss records, accusations, memes, chart records, and enormous public discussion. And culturally, Kendrick emerged from the conflict with the stronger public narrative. For Drake, that was significant. He had survived rap conflicts before, Meek Mill, Pusha T, others. But Kendrick was different. The battle attacked not only Drake the rapper, it challenged his authenticity, relationships, public identity, and place inside hip-hop culture. For years, Drake's greatest strength had been his ability to control the conversation around himself. After the Kendrick battle, that control had been damaged, and the projects that followed entered a completely different environment. Drake's first major full-length project after the battle was not an aggressive solo rap album. It was Some Sexy Songs for You, a collaborative album with Party Next Door. That choice was fascinating. Party Next Door had been part of the OVO world for years. His atmospheric R&B sound existed naturally beside Drake's romantic side. So instead of immediately trying to prove something through another rap war, Drake returned to one of the musical identities that had always been safest for him. Relationships. R&B. Late-night music. Melody. The album debuted at number 1 with roughly 250,000 equivalent units. It became another major streaming success. But the project did not completely escape the context surrounding Drake. Listeners searched for references to the feud. Every lyric was examined. Every sign of bitterness became part of the discussion. That demonstrated the problem Drake now faced. After a battle that large, even music that was not explicitly about Kendrick would still be heard through Kendrick. Drake needed a stronger reset. That reset began taking shape through ICEMAN. The ICEMAN rollout was unusually elaborate. Instead of simply announcing a release date, Drake slowly built a visual world around the album. Ice imagery appeared throughout the campaign. Toronto became central again. Live stream episodes helped turn the rollout into an ongoing event. By the time the release arrived in May 2026, expectations were enormous. People wanted to know what post-Kendrick Drake actually sounded like. Would he sound angry, defensive, embarrassed, motivated? Would he directly address everything that had happened? Or would he behave as if the battle had changed nothing? ICEMAN leaned toward a more competitive Drake, but the album's most important message may have come from the numbers. It debuted at number 1 with 463,000 equivalent album units. It became Drake's 15th number 1 album on the Billboard 200. That placed him in historic territory among solo artists and gave him more number 1 albums than any other rapper. The symbolism was obvious. Kendrick had damaged Drake culturally. But Drake's commercial power was still enormous. That created the central contradiction of the entire post-battle period. What does losing mean when millions of people continue listening? What does winning mean when the artist supposedly defeated still dominates charts? ICEMAN could not erase what happened, but it demonstrated that Drake's audience remained incredibly difficult to move. And he had another surprise. ICEMAN was not the only album he released that day. On the same day as ICEMAN, Drake released Habibti. If ICEMAN represented the competitive side of Drake, Habibti leaned more directly into the romantic identity that had been part of his music since the beginning. That contrast matters because Drake had spent his entire career refusing to choose between those two identities, the rapper who wants respect and the singer who makes relationship music. For almost 20 years, critics occasionally treated that combination like a contradiction. By 2026, Drake was no longer attempting to resolve it. He could simply release full projects for different sides of his audience. Habibti debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 with 114,000 equivalent album units. For almost any other artist, a number 2 album would be the central commercial story. For Drake, it became the second part of something much stranger, because one more Drake album was directly behind it. Maid of Honor completed the trilogy. The project moved more freely through different grooves and tempos, continuing the genre experimentation that Drake had explored through projects like More Life and Honestly, Nevermind. And commercially, it debuted at number 3. That created something no artist had previously accomplished in the weekly history of the Billboard 200. Drake occupied number 1, number 2, and number 3. At the same time, ICEMAN, Habibti, Maid of Honor. 3 different projects representing different pieces of the Drake identity. Rap, R&B, global experimentation. And all 3 existed simultaneously at the top of the album chart. It was almost a perfect summary of his career. Drake had spent 20 years refusing to become only one thing. By 2026, he had become commercially powerful enough to release those different identities separately and still dominate the chart with all of them. Drake's discography looks enormous when viewed simply as a list, but when you follow it chronologically, a much clearer story appears. Room for improvement was an actor trying to prove he could rap. Comeback Season was that rapper beginning to develop a personality. So Far Gone introduced the emotional rap and R&B formula that would change his career. Thank Me Later proved the hype could become commercial success. Take Care turned vulnerability into power. Nothing Was the Same turned the rising star into someone who expected dominance. If You're Reading, This It's Too Late reminded hip-hop that the singer could still rap. What a Time to Be Alive proved Drake could enter another rapper's world. Views transformed him into a global streaming superstar. More Life turned genre hopping into part of the business model. Scorpion proved that even a public rap defeat could coexist with enormous commercial success. Care Package showed that Drake's Old Lucy's had become valuable enough to function like a new album. Dark Lane demo tapes demonstrated how easily he could turn leaked and scattered material into an event. Certified Lover Boy transformed the Drake stereotype into branding. Honestly, Nevermind showed that he was still willing to take stylistic risks. Her Loss proved he could return to rap almost immediately. For All the Dogs revealed the difficulty of satisfying fans who each wanted a different version of old Drake. Some Sexy Songs 4, You returned him to OVO style R&B after the biggest rap battle of his career. ICEMAN proved the battle had not destroyed his commercial power. Habibti preserved the emotional side, and Maid of Honor completed a 3-album release that placed Drake in all 3 top positions of the Billboard 200 simultaneously. The strange thing about Drake's career is that the argument surrounding him has never completely disappeared. Is he one of the greatest rappers, or the greatest streaming artist who happens to rap? Did he expand hip-hop? Or become so large that he stopped belonging to any single genre? Did his willingness to adapt make him versatile or calculated? Did vulnerability change rap, or simply create a formula he eventually repeated too often? Those questions have followed Drake for almost 20 years. But there is one fact the argument cannot erase. Very few artists have remained this commercially relevant for this long while, changing their sound this many times. Drake began his career trying to convince people that an actor could become a rapper. 20 years later, the more difficult question is figuring out what category could possibly contain everything Drake became. And maybe that is the real story behind every Drake album. He never spent his career trying to fit into one version of hip-hop. He spent it making hip-hop expand enough to fit every version of him.